يسعدنا أن نرحب فيكم مرة أخرى في هذه الجلسة.
We are happy to welcome you in this first session.
لا شك أن هذا الموضوع أصبح من الاهتمام ما يتطلب.
There is no doubt that this is an important event and in which we have sessions. We also study the ways to change it and to find solution. We don't want the Gulf countries to be behind in resisting to mondialization, to globalization. Many Gulf cities are too. So we see now many skyscrapers and towers. This brought an invasion or the existence of many people from various cultures, religions, and languages. And we don't know if the synchronization between all these components exists or not, but there is some deregulation, and some of the societies find themselves in weird situations. So what is the reality of this social tissue, if we can call it, and what is awaiting for the Gulf Arab identity? So the speakers will talk about it. We will talk during this session about the social transformation and the various identities and tribes. Mr. Mohamed Ghanem Alrumaihi, he is supervising social studies and participated in publications in Kuwait about social studies and Arab culture. Dr. Mohamed, you have. I am happy to be with you in this historical session. I called it 3 women and 1 woman. 3 women and a man. So we learned and we have been taught how to talk in general lectures. As they said, we have to start with a breaking joke. This is what I wanted to say. I thank the Arab Center for this annual opportunity, and we are happy to meet, because it's not important, as our colleague said, that there are skyscrapers. The importance is that we have freedom and liberties. So we will talk freely. As you know all, the free societies always prevail, while the others are defeated. We are talking about the Gulf countries, and I would like to start with 2 issues. The first thing is that the Gulf Cooperation Council represents 55% of the national income, GDP, of the Arabs, and represents 14% of the population only. So if 14% of the population have got 55% of GDP and they cannot develop their societies, So what to think, what to say about the others? So we start by this. The second issue is a worry which has become a cultural sickness or disease. It is the lack of social studies, and societies cannot develop without social studies. And these studies in the Arab world in general and in the Gulf are very few, because we have a conservative societies and they are more superficial. Therefore, social studies, sciences, are imprisoned in traditional frames. So I will allow me to
طلبوا مني الإخوان واقع النسيج الاجتماعي. واقع النسيج الاجتماعي يمكن كلنا عارفينه، أنا راح أمر عليه بسرعة، ثم نتحدث عن التحديات. التحديات اللي اخترتها أنا هي 6، يمكن تكون 7، يمكن تكون 9 إلى آخره، ولكن في تصوري أن مجموع ال6 تحديات ربما مؤشر كبير على نوع التحديات التي لدينا. حتى لا نتأخر كثيرا، فإننا نتحدث الآن عن واقع النسيج الاجتماعي. وواقع النسيج الاجتماعي، أولا الكتابة حول مجتمعات الخليج تنقسم في الغالب إلى قسمين من قراءاتي الشخصية: إفراط في المديح أو إفراط في الذم، وأما إقطاعية زبائنية، أو مثل ما يقول الأخ زميلنا عبد الخالق لحظة الخليج العربية، اللي هو يعني صار عندنا كل ما يجب أن يكون. تفريط في وضع الحقائق، ويعني في بعض الكتابات من 4-5 سنوات قالوا أن دول الخليج راح يعني تنتهي. تعرفون أنتم الكتاب المشهور ما بعد الشيوخ، صار لنا 5 سنوات ننتظر البروفيسي، حتى الآن احنا موجودين. وبالتالي هذا النوع من الكتابات صحيح تدغدغ المشاعر، ولكنها ليست واقعية في رأيي. مجتمعات الخليج أيضا من أكثر المجتمعات اللي كتب عنها ومن أقلها فهما أيضا في تقديري.
It is most of the writings are parachuted, and there are people who just stay a short time and then pretend to be expert in the Gulf. It says that the experts in the Gulf among the Americans are more than the Gulf population, and people who are not experts don't know that the palms produce hundreds of types of dates. So what are the similar points or points of similarity and which differ? After the petrol era, the modern countries started to differ partially. The traditional society were relying on the pearl and started 1,000 years ago, and also commerce, trade, and travels from the Indian subcontinent, and also very limited agriculture. And agriculture is very important in our heritage. And there was a saying that whoever has a palm tree is a rich man. And there are many examples. And there are proverbs or famous sayings that if you have the date, you will not have problems. And also there is fishing and also more traditional activities, manufacturers. So it was relying on people to produce wealth. So there is also a social classification. For example, in the diving, the diver cannot climb the palm tree. So we have proverbs which express that. There is also migration between coasts or cities, coastal cities like Doha, Manama, movements from one to another. There is also social links, which is based on keeping the wealth and the capital or the agricultural land. The behavior also practices. There is a tribal society, family, and moving from the traditional society to the new society. I describe it as that these societies, they are linked to the desert, to the sea, and then it moved to exporting oil. About the desert, socially, the oil societies, because they were not producing that oil, they brought with them, or they kept with them, the traditional values and continued based on the characteristic of the desert, and they found themselves in the globalization, and the values of the new society were taken mainly from the old societies. But there is a mixture of values. Once I was traveling with Qatar Airways, and then there were 4 or 5 ladies dressed in black, and I slept. When I woke up, I thought I was in the Champs-Élysées. We have double standards, and there are others. The Society of Seaports in the Gulf, it is the communities of the cities. When you go and buy bread, where do you buy the bread? You buy it from the Iranian baker. So, because we have Iranian culture, African culture, desertic culture, the attraction factors created resistance from the nationalists that so our daughter, for example, married somebody else. Say, why did you marry her? This is represents a real problem. So we cannot create a new society and integrate it in a real way, but there is a polarization. So it is up or down. The power, the governments used to rely on these. So there is a new power, new authority. So we go to the challenges now. I said we had 6 challenges. How to bring this society from the traditional to the producing society. We have been trying, but we couldn't achieve anything. So there are a lot of studies in this matter. There were some attempts which are not that strong. So there are now ideas that the era of oil is going to come to an end. So what are the aspects of the prices going down and the politicization. Mr. Trump says, bring the prices down, and we do. In Europe, in 20 years, there won't be cars with petrol. It will be electrical cars. And there are decisions which reduce the need for oil and petrol. There is no, in the horizon, any way to face this challenge. The second challenge is the weakness in the product of education. There is amelioration in quantity but not in quality. And it doesn't help to innovate. In the Gulf, we gave the education to conservative powers, which put the foundation of conservative idea, Western and Egyptian. The Egyptian have a history, who is Dunlop, who made this education in order to have employees for the Egyptian government. The education is relying on knowledge, based on knowledge and skills and human attitude from life. If there is no knowledge and skills and it is not a real education. The knowledge is changing, so we have to say to our students that this knowledge will change and you will have to look for the changes. It's not just memorization. For the skills, we can say that the skills are a real catastrophe, or the lack of skills. Most of our students don't have any of skills, and the curriculums are kidnapped. Allow me to tell you a story. I have a long article about and I have been informed that we would like to talk about conciliation. My name is Mohamed. The first question is, how do you affirm that the writer is a Muslim? The question is stupid, and then the question is about Islam. So I was surprised, and the minister said that she has a problem. So education is still in conservative hands, and the government doesn't seem to be willing to promote modern educational institutions. The outcome of education in the Gulf seem to be catastrophic also. You know about falsified diplomas, and it is really strange. You know that if you have lemon, and if you want to reduce the taste of lemon, we put a lot of water. So if we look into the diplomas, the third challenge is the social tissue, and there are many studies about that. And my problem with that is that we don't have a plan to integrate the social categories, the Indian or Arab who lives with you for 50 years, you tell him bye-bye and that's finished. So there is no plan to integrate these people. And then it is only political approach. And the way to deal of these things is not proper. For example, in Kuwait, if they say, let's reduce, there was one candidate and said, so if he promised to reduce the servants at home from 3 to 2. The administrative and legal challenges also are many. Sheikh Yusuf bin Isa said at the beginning of the 20th century, the Kuwait will be right when its emir is just and the judge is fair. Otherwise, the country, with the money of oil, we needed to modernize our society. There is a lack of laws, and some of the laws are from the Middle Age. I don't need to tell you some of these. Also, choosing the administrative skills, it is based on who you know, not what you know. There is a bureaucracy, a very heavy bureaucracy. There is Kuwaiti, there are 50 procedures for contracts in Kuwait, and there are many activities which needs 70 days, 60 days, and some of them even 4 years. The fifth challenge is the security challenge, internally and externally. So the Gulf failed in making or promoting the participation of the citizens, and there are risks. I am convinced that the riba or the interest economically brings lack of tolerance. There are no structures for the modern civilized cities, so we tend to rely on security solutions. The security threats internally and externally are many and are heavy, and there is a new element which is the social communications, which represents a problem. And the last challenge is the cultural one. I think the culture is the vehicle of development and the society, and the cultural space is full of holes, and we have a lack of we had also traffic culture, and if we had reasonable consumption, we would have solved many things, and we would have had stability also in the society. Of course, we are relying the tradition. That's why I am calling to try to detail the heritage and to study it and review it. Finally, I can say that the suppositions about how to deal with the challenges, I made a quotation about the history of civilization. He says that the human being, when he thinks for his tomorrow, for the future, he gets into worries. Many of the challenges are difficultly manageable individually. We cannot solve our problems on our own. We have to look again how to review the GCC, and I am convinced of that, to improve the quality of education, because societies now are talking about innovation. We are not in a society, we have to be creative, and this is very important, and our education now doesn't allow that. Corruption also is to use the power to serve your interest. So if I am in the faculty, university, I give a good mark to somebody, to a student, and he gives me $10. This is corruption. Maybe digital technology will reduce corruption, and there is a subject that we should think about, which is not allow the administration of having property of things. Shall I explain or not? No sound. For example, that the young man from that family should be the minister. You want me to go to prison, and I'm not ready to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this great presentation, and be assured that there will be nothing bad going to happen. So it was a great presentation, and I'm sure that the audience noted some remarks. I'd like to start from where you concluded. Aiden's paradise does not exist, only in the hereafter. And next speaker is Dr. Kaltham Ali Al-Ghanim. She's gonna talk about different identities in the Gulf area, starting from the tribe, moving to the national state. She's a professor at Qatar University, and also she's the director of the Center for Humanities in the University of Qatar, and she published also different publications in her field. Dr. Kaltham, you have 15 minutes. So I'm going to talk about citizenship and identity in the GCC area. We want to clarify the relationship between citizenship and identity, and if the multiple identities might be a challenge for the citizenship in the area. First of all, I'd like to talk about the reason why we have such diversity. There might be some historical roots, and we'll see that, and maybe there might be also a result of the expansion and the changes at the level of the demographic structure. Since 2000, the region, the states of the region adopted new economic policies, and of course this engendered a higher need for labor. Of course, that all started in the 70s, but it developed gradually. But since 2000, since the beginning of the new millennium, there was a huge economic jump in the region, and also there was a huge urban expansion in the region. For example, if we want to speak about Qatar, until 2004, Qatar had only 700,000 people. Today we have around 3 million. So this brought about a lot of diversity, and maybe native Arabic speakers are minority now in their home countries. The region, of course, had the same religion, the same culture, the same social relations, and also they viewed the tribe as the foundation or the core of society. How far is this social structure is still present? This is something which can put into discussion. The social and economic changes and developments, of course, impacted and affected for sure the economic situation. When we talk about identity, diversity, and citizenship, well, there were a lot of studies that have been conducted, and some concluded that the cultural identity is threatened in the region due to immigration, and we might see a struggle of identities, maybe because of conflict of interests. And some years ago, there was a call, specifically in some GCC countries, that a large number of labor should be deported or sent back to the original countries because the local population does not have access to enough jobs. So there is a competition between different identities. So we have, for example, the Pakistanis, the Indians. So everyone is living in the GCC countries in their own community. There is a kind of isolation or identity isolation. And so because every community is living on its own. But the national culture, the national identity is still protected through direct and indirect methods. The aspects of threat are related maybe to other circumstances, maybe the education which is now being vehiculated in the English language, and maybe this is one of the challenges. When we talk about identity, we need to define this word. The identity is being able to define one's cultural beliefs and his cultural belonging. And everyone is looking and searching for social recognition, not for his own identity, individual identity, but an identity which is related to the tribe. And the majority of the population in the Gulf countries are related to the tribes. And of course, every tribe in the GCC area has its own clothing traditions, and you see this also reflected in the daily life. And therefore, this is also related to the cultural identity and economic capabilities. You see this also at the level of individuals who are trying to foster the meaning and the notion of the tribe. The foundations of identity are known here in the region. First of all, the Islamic religion, the Arabic language, the public or culture or knowledge, and also the common history. The question that we need to pose here, is there a real threat for the identity? Of course, we have witnessed waves of migration, labor migration, for and foremost to the GCC country, but I need to say that the the most aspects actually are domestic rather than external. For example, the transformation of family structures, the social structures, but the question, did these aspects and factors affect the national identity? Can we say that these changes and these transformations affected only the lifestyle of people, of the citizens, but did not enhance or improve the identity feeling of GCC citizens? The challenges that GCC citizens are facing with regard to the criteria is, after 60 years of education, we still see a lot of interference between tradition and modernity in all ways of lives, whether we talk about the form or also the content. And also we still have the arranged marriage in GCC area within the different countries, within different tribes. I conducted the study in this regard, and also the males they prefer to marry their cousin, and also the ladies or the females they still like to marry among the relatives. So this overlap or interference is still there, even though we see a lot of modernity when we talk about urbanization and so on, but the mentality is still traditional. Of course, we have a multi-identical dimension, but still we see the traditional way of life, and there is also a kind of loyalty to all these levels of identity. But how far we do need a dominating identity, which is the real engine for any change? Of course, the multiple references, we have a religious reference, a political one, social one, and so on. We have a lot of levels of loyalty. The Progress project is in its most actually economical, but can you give me extra time, please? So this reality leads to multiple identities. So what does citizenship need? We need a citizen who enjoys his or her rights and also fulfills and lives up to his obligations and commitments. Is the current situation fostering this identity? And GCC countries were unable to keep and protect their language, and we know the language is one of the most important aspects of identity, and all countries are going towards education in English language. The majority of our youth could not think or write in the Arabic language, and they cannot express themselves in the Arabic language, but they think in a Western way, maybe. So we saw this change in the generations. If someone is writing here a novel, he's writing in English. So this is a part, a small part of the danger and risk I wanted to talk about. What do we need to do? We need to strengthen the notions of citizenship and belonging to the nation, not only in slogans, but we need to see this in reality. The real thing we need to see is belonging to a country needs to mean that we are ready to identify with the identity of that country, of that nation, and we need not only to think about technology and urbanization, so we need to see a real a link and real protection of the identity on the ground. So of course there are a lot of factors and a lot of circumstances leading to this situation. So a lot of art traditions disappeared and then reappeared again, and of course some tribal tensions existed earlier, disappeared, and then now reappeared again. But we have also a lot of young people who studied abroad in Western universities. We might have a student, a citizen who studied outside of the region, who came back to his country, but he's trying to live a traditional life. So the structure changed, but the content did not change. This might be because of the strength of this structure, or maybe because of strengthening it. Its strength is related to the weakness of the civil society here. In order to establish an association, of course, you will face a lot of challenges to create any association of civil society. The number of civil society associations is very, very small compared to with other societies in other countries. Of course, sometimes it's better than the current situation. So there are some specific circumstances which are leading and pushing civil society not to be active. I conducted a study related to young people to find out more about the multiple identities. So we had around 3,000 students. Students were aged between 14 and 25. So I found out that the youth has a different identity, and but how far these identities are in conflict or overlapping? Are they homogeneous? On which identity is first? So I found out that the Islamic religion is number one as identity. Second, belonging to the Qatari nation and belonging to the Arab world, and also belonging to the tribe. We are talking here about young people, but they still think and still hold strongly to the tribe. Ibn Khaldun said in one of his publications, the tribe is still dominating the whole society. Did this really change? No, these are the results. So the youth think here that 63% think that belonging to the tribe is very important. This reflects the strength of the tribal structure in the country. Of course, multiple loyalties is another issue. I noticed that female, for example, the expression "I'm gonna sacrifice myself for my tribe," the percentage in terms of male is much higher than females. What's the reason? I don't know. Maybe we need further studies in this regard. Maybe we don't have enough time to talk about modernity and traditions. Maybe this is something which goes back to many decades in history, and the modern institution. So if you allow me to give the summary of my presentation, since we're running out of time. There is a lot of hesitation on the part of the GCC citizen, and the citizens prefer to stake and to hold to the tribe because it's an part and parcel of its development. Although the citizens in the GCC countries are living a kind of multiple in a kind of multiple identity environment, but still GCC countries are or citizens are proud of their new lifestyle, proud of belonging to the tribe and also to the country, but also proud of the modern change which is visible in their countries, and this also affected the development at the economic level. And I think developing the economy is not enough to safeguard society and its identity.
Thank you, Dr. Kaltham. I'm sorry to interrupt you. We go to the third speaker in this session. She is Courtney Freer, and she is reviewing her thesis about the role of the Muslim Brothers in the Gulf.
Shukran jazilan. And I apologize for speaking in English. My Arabic has suffered quite a bit since I moved out of Qatar a couple years back. But I'm going to change course a little bit and talk about the political implications of sustained tribal identity. And really, since the time of Ibn Khaldun, of course, academics have tried to figure out this connection between politics and tribes. When it comes to the Gulf in particular, Egyptian diplomat Tahir Bashir's quip that these states are little more than tribes with flags, in his words, has often been repeated as a way of talking about the ways in which these states are clan-based, essentially. The notion of a sustained tribalism in the Gulf is further bolstered by rentier state theory, which of course explains political behavior as essentially based on patron-client relations, with tribes critical clients of the state. Indeed, in the rentier context, the maxim no taxation, no representation is taken to describe the extent of political life incorrectly, of course, in my view. And essentially, sorry, I'll slow down. I just had coffee, sorry. But essentially, the notion is that without, that people essentially give up their political rights in order to have benefits from the state in another sense. And certainly tribes have been seen as part of this kind of co-opted base of society, I think. And further, I think it's important to note that tribes traditionally did provide this welfare, and now this has definitely been taken over by the state, and so it leaves us with this puzzle of what do tribes do now? And I'm going to talk a little bit about how tribes influence the way in which people vote in certain states in the Gulf. Gregory Goss, in a 1994 book called Tribalism and Islam in the Gulf, the Most Important Arms of the State, providing institutional support and ideological legitimation to the regimes. And as a result, he says that space, political and social, is traditionally provided to these two segments of society, so Islam and tribes, essentially. And that governments here basically very much want to promote, or don't have any problem with, of course, Islam or tribalism, or really the existence of people's identities linked to these aspects. And in my previous work, I've talked about how Islam remains a potent kind of social and political force, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about the political capital linked to tribes in what I call the super rentier states of Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE, where we would be least likely to see independent social or political groupings if we were to believe rentier state theory, essentially. So I'm going to go through each kind of case to talk about the ways in which tribes affect voting patterns, starting with Kuwait. Kuwait, of course, is somewhat an anomaly in that it has a very active and vocal parliament with political blocs arranged around ideological affiliation. So you have Salafis, secular leftists, all kinds of groups inside of that parliament. And in this largely homogenous ethnic environment with the majority of the population Sunni and Arab, I think the major division in Kuwait arguably exists between the fully urbanized longtime citizens, Hadar, and more recently naturalized tribal figures, or Badu, many of whom received Kuwaiti nationality after the 1960s. And Hadar is kind of defined as a Kuwaiti whose forefathers were in Kuwait prior to the oil era. whereas Badu are seen as people who came after that period and sometimes are maligned as having come in order to gain the benefits of oil wealth. So in addition to kind of the legislation on citizenship, which is distinguished between original and naturalized citizens, state housing policies also in between the 50s and the 80s led to a physical segregation between these two segments in society inside of Kuwait. And so I think that's why we see more of a division there than we do in the other countries that I'm going to talk about. And still, in a somewhat ironic turn, what services and employment the Kuwaiti government has provided to these kind of Badu communities in the past decades is seen as having fostered greater reliance on the state. In Longva's words, she says that a critical attitude towards the government is an important feature in the definition of Hadar identity. In contrast, Badu are said to revere government authority, and their attitude towards the ruling family has been subsumed by several Hadar as obsequious hand-kissing. So if this relationship were purely clientelistic, we would expect that the Badu would be loyal because they were given greater amounts of kind of goods, basically. And that's actually the opposite in this case. So talking about kind of the electoral dynamics, I think that the arrangement of elections inside of Kuwait does take into account the political and geographical split between these two segments of society. In fact, ahead of the 1981 elections, the number of electoral districts was increased from 10 to 25. And this was something that a lot of Kuwaiti academics that I've read have said has bolstered basically Badu representation inside of Kuwait. The number of tribal constituencies increased, with the number of shares rising from 19 in the 1963 polls to 27 in 1985. And there's since been a reformulation of this again. But I think this kind of, at least during this period, tribes were seen as a safe constituency for the government, and people seemed to vote alongside lines of tribal identity. Following the Iraqi invasion and the restoration of Kuwaiti parliament in 1992, it seems that tribes have moved to be less loyal, less reliably loyal, and more interested in pursuing their own interests within the political system. And Nathan Brown suggests that despite past government efforts to promote tribal representation as a shield against criticism, tribes have actually grown increasingly aware of their own political capital and political identity, and therefore kind of trying to get more and more for their own constituencies. And tribes have changed, tribal MPs seem to have changed their tactics in recent years, being more willing to question ministers in particular. And one important example was this in 2007, when a number of tribal MPs essentially grilled the health minister for a fire that broke out in a hospital in a kind of tribal area in Kuwait. So in 2006, the electoral map was changed once again, and the number of districts was decreased from 25 to 5. And we still see that tribes are winning, at least in 2008, they won 25 of 50 seats. And so there still is very much kind of this tribal representation, which is also bolstered by the fact that tribes in Kuwait do run these primaries prior to elections to make sure that their candidates are kind of set before the elections happen. And I think what's interesting to see is to see this journey in Kuwait from tribes that were seen as reliably loyal to now composing part of what's called kind of the opposition movement. And Musallam al-Barak is, of course, probably the best known opposition leader, and he initially was from Al-Muftah tribe, and of course has kind of, his identity now I think is more as an ideological member of the opposition rather than as a member of his tribe, but it's interesting to see how that has shifted. And so essentially what we see in the Kuwaiti case is that in a state lacking formal political parties, tribes have taken on some of the roles and filled by parties. So tribal identity replaces party brand, essentially, I would argue. Moving to the Qatari case, I mean, historically, Qatar, of course, is quite different. It didn't have an early developed merchant or even permanently settled urban population until later on. As in Kuwait, though, tribes were traditionally seen as kind of a support base for the government, perhaps because they weren't linked to Arab nationalism kind of in the 50s and 60s in the same way that some members of kind of the merchant classes were. And in fact, in 1963, when crowds gathered to protest the overthrow of Abdul-Karim Qasim in Iraq, Badu were kind of patrolling the streets and making sure security was in place to protect the government, essentially, and the emir. So we see this history of the Badu, again, being seen as kind of loyal to the government, but at the same time retaining a tribal identity. So of course, Qatar does have an elected central municipal council, And it has 29 members whose role essentially is advising the Ministry of Municipal Affairs. And Alan Fromhertz writes a bit about how the elections have been arranged. And essentially there are 7 municipalities, and he says that they've largely been drawn according to old tribal districts, and then says that this means that people tend to vote along tribal lines. I'd be interested to hear kind of other people's thoughts on that, because there's not a ton of work done on this. I would say that because political life here doesn't seem to revolve around elections in the way that it does in Kuwait, the political relevance of tribes is actually seen outside of this realm and is seen more through kind of the Majlis system and in other ways inside of Qatar. So it's a slightly different system. But I think that from what I've heard in interviews, by using tribal ties, basically members of tribes can bypass state structures that are sometimes slower to respond and more cumbersome to access, leading to a much more personalized and sometimes more effective system. So moving to the UAE quickly, the tribal structure of the UAE and of course the government structure differs due to the fact that it's divided into 7 emirates. And also, I mean, the tribal arrangement of the UAE was kind of, the hierarchy was kind of frozen in place when the British arranged their treaties with various tribes. And so we've seen kind of the Bani Yas tribe in charge of Abu Dhabi essentially overtaking the power of the Qawasim in the Northern Emirates kind of in recent years. In terms of how tribal identity shows itself in the UAE in terms of elections, there's one elected body, the Federal National Council, the FNC. Unlike the other bodies I talked about, it's not elected through universal suffrage, but rather there's an electoral college. And this electoral college is essentially includes is very carefully selected. So sorry, I've lost my spot. But essentially, the pool of people who are allowed to vote for this body has been recently expanded, but still includes less than half of the Emirati national population. A 2015 study showed that a random sample of 1,800 Emirati members of that electoral college, 73% of them were from Abu Dhabi, and 45% of them worked in public sector jobs. And so this suggests that there is kind of a trend towards Abu Dhabi, a trend towards government employees as well. The same survey showed that 43% of Emiratis considered kinship when they were voting. So that's a pretty clear indication of how tribal identity seems to affect political behavior. So I guess I'll just by means of wrapping up, I think Mehran Kamrava maybe explains best the position of tribes and a so-called kind of tribal ideology in the Arabian Peninsula by saying that this ideology permeates most institutions and practices, even though it's never formally articulated. And I think that the Gulf states kind of do manage tribes to a certain extent, but at the same time, tribal identity is still very much alive and well and very much linked both to social life as well as to political life. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I didn't even need to remind you about the 5 minutes. شكرا جزيلا Courtney.
Thank you very much, Ms. Courtney. You took less than 50 minutes. Thank you. We will open the door for questions. We have less than 25 minutes. So if possible, introduce yourself and the question, and don't exceed 1 minute. We start with our guests.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
تفضل حمد.
حمد علي المهندي، باحث في العلوم السياسية. نشكركم. أول شيء عندي تعليق وسؤال بخصوص عنوان الجلسة اللي هي إشكالية الهوية والقيم. من منظوري أن الإشكالية الأولى تناولنا موضوع الهوية، أن احنا نشوفها في المجتمعات الخليجية بنظرة عامة تفترض أن احنا أغلبية نشكل أغلبية، المواطنين الخليجيين يشكلون أغلبية بعدد السكان. الحقيقة لا، إذا رجعنا حق الإحصائيات.
The reality is that the Gulf citizens are not don't represent the majority but the minority.
والتمييز وليست وسيلة تعزيز المواطنة. في كل تناولنا الموضوع الهوية نربطها بالمواطنة ومنظورنا لها ما يعزز.
So maybe we should link the identity to citizenship.
حالتنا الخاصة الخليجية.
with regard to our special situation,
في التركيبة السكانية يعني في نماذج صارت في تقريبا في دولة قطر مثلا
there are
اللي جاتنا في الستينات
specimens or examples.
صارت أن مكتملين المواطنة بعد ذلك فهل ممكن تنظير
Sorry, but I cannot hear distinctly.
شكرا دكتور وشكر موصول
Thank you for the organizers
عندي 3 أسئلة سريعة
and for the speakers.
تساوي فيما بينكم سؤال أبدأ بالأخت من بريطانيا لماذا لم تشملي في دراستك عمان مع أن التجربة العمانية فريدة من نوعها
We didn't talk about the Omani experience,
عمان كانت الدولة الأولى التي شاركت
although
المرأة كاملة في الانتخابات
it
كمنتخبة كمترشحة وفي الانتخابات بشكل عام
was one of the first.
عمان بهذا الجانب. السؤال للدكتورنا الفاضل وعزيزنا محمد الرميحي
For Mr. Alrumaihi, the education issues
ألا ترى
and identity.
في التعليم هو واحد من هذه الأسباب؟
Don't you see that the
التعليم
westernization in education is one of the main factors
والذي سبب في هذه الجزئية بالذات
which brought to this situation?
أشرت إلى القبيلة والسلطة
The
الهوية في
tribe and the
وأشرت في
government and the identity.
بالفعل هي كانت هذه النتيجة لما أشرت إنه النساء عندنا القدرة أو مستعدات الدفاع
When women
عن القبيلة
found that they have the ability to defend,
كذا كانت النسبة 43% من النساء أتوقع كانت في هذه الجزئية إذا ما كانت في الذاكرة أو العكس عندها تتنازل عن القبيلة. أوكي ألا تربطي ذلك إنه حينما تضعف الدولة وتضعف المؤسسات الدستورية في الدولة تتقوى القبيلة وبالعكس.
don't you see that when the government institutions are weaker, this will make the tribes stronger?
محمد المصري باحث بالمركز العربي
من أهل اليمين.
محمد المصري.
لا بس أنا يعني عندي تعليق حول استخدام
I would like
الكمية
to a comment on the technical assistance in studying identities,
شديدة خاصة في موضوع
especially in a complex issue like identity.
لسؤال بيندرج في الغرب أنت قبل كل شيء مثلا مسلم أو عربي
You are a Muslim or Arab or Qatari
من القبيلة الفلانية
or from this or that tribe.
تحتمل هذه الأشياء جميعا. اثنين حصر المواطنين بواحد من الأسئلة له علاقة بالسياق. حتى الاستطلاعات الرأي اللي كنا بنقوم فيها
Even the opinion surveys,
أي درجة المكون في المكون القبلي في الهوية مثلا في الأردن
to know how much the tribe belonging
إلى هذا الموضوع وبتعطي
is important.
مش أكثر من هيك يعني فهذا الموضوع بخوف. بعدين إنه جزء من الهوية الثقافية
And part of the cultural identity
مش إشكالية. هو الإشكالية عندما تتحول
is not the problem,
الانتماء أو الجزء
but the problem is when
الهوية اللي هو ممكن يكون قبلي أو عشائري
the
أو
belonging
عائلي
becomes
إلى أداة سياسية
tribal.
أو تتحول القبيلة
It
إلى
moves then to
مجموعة أو لاعب سياسي في ضمن
political
إطار
interests.
حداثي للدولة أو إطار حديث للدولة. شكرا.
شكرا دكتور. تفضلي وبعدين زميل.
مرحبا، أمينة الحجري، عمان. دكتورة كلثم، ذكرت عدة مفارقات في موضوع الهوية. أولا إن القوة الاقتصادية
So the economic power and situation brought many transformations. Do you think that the financial again would reduce the identity. Is the Gulf going to societies where cosmopolitan, this means that all these cultures and categories will be together without interaction between them? Peace be upon you. Thank you for our speakers. Dr. Rashid Naimi. My question is, what is the role of the government, the state, and the thinkers about the national identity and the transformations from the side of the countries, of the government, or the intellectuals? Where does this take us to?
يعطيكم العافية وشكرا على العرض الكثير كان قيم. سؤالي للدكتورة كلثم، في ظل الحديث عن الهوية والارتباط بالقبيلة من جهة والواقع الاقتصادي من جهة أخرى، وبناء على العرض اللي تفضلت فيه حضرتك، هل هنالك أي تناسب بين المستوى الاقتصادي
Is there any relations between the economic level
ودرجة الولاء للقبيلة؟
and the loyalty to tribe?
هل هي آنية مع وجود أزمات، وهل تختفي بعد انتهاء هذه الأزمات؟ وشكرا.
أنا أشوف أحمر بس. أوكي.
سؤالي هو عن تركيبة
صوت.
السؤال هو عن
ممكن بس التعريف؟
سهيلة، دكتورة سهيلة عبادة، منتجة التلفزيون العربي. سؤالي هو عن نسبة القبيلة في مؤسسات الدولة في دول الخليج.
هاي ما راح تلاقينها ولا عند الجني الأحمر.
وأثر ذلك على الهوية الخليجية.
And how does it reflect on the Gulf identity?
إن شاء الله تكون أهل الفردوس الأعلى. بس الصف الثالث وبعدين ننتقل لأهل الفردوس الأعلى. أيوة هنا.
السلام عليكم، صباح الخير. خالد المشيخي، سلطنة عمان. شكرا للجميع على هذا الحوار الشيق جدا.
Thank you for this interesting discussion.
دكتور، لدينا رؤية اقتصادية، لدينا في أغلب مجتمعات
We have an economic vision and political vision. Do we have a social vision as Gulf societies or communities?
خالد مفتاح، باحث أكاديمي. دكتور أبو غانم، بيض الله وجهك ويعطيك العافية. سؤال بس سريع، موقع التعليم من التغيير الثقافي وهو يشبه
Quick question about the cultural component.
بدليل لو كان شخص من قبيلة معروفة،
if somebody is from well-known tribe, but he belongs to a country who is not in a permanent and fruitful contact with another Gulf society. How does it work? The social solitude. For example, when there is social problem in one country, the other country would complement or help. About the survey you made with 3,000 students, don't they suffer from schizophrenia? In the difference between the theory and the practice.
فقط هناك
Dr. Courtney,
ازدواجية. فقط هناك فرق بين القبيلة والقبلية.
there is a difference between the tribe and tribalism.
مظلة اجتماعية ولكن للأسف أحيانا يتم توظيفها
Sometimes the tribal aspect is used in the for political purposes. This is the problematic. Another problematic is the lack of political parties gave the opportunity for the tribes to play a more important role. And every time there is a lack in some field, the tribe plays that role.
Excuse me, Dr. Ali, you'll be the last speaker, maybe. Very quickly. Please, we cannot hear you clearly. Can you get closer to the microphone? Very quickly, Dr. Kaltham, you speak about the issue of identity. You mentioned 4 different factors, religion, culture, and history. Actually, the identity in GCC area has the common language and more or less the same religion, and also has the same economic structure. So actually we have a common history. I have a problem defining the identity because everyone looking at the West has been the different. Regarding the military service of GCC citizens in the country, this is something in the region. This is something new because it's bringing about a real shift. Last year in Qatar, the majority of high school students went for military service. We start with Dr. Kaltham, if you can keep it briefly, if possible. Saying that the relation between identity and citizenship, identity is actually related to the individual, and also belonging to a nation, being a citizen of a nation is related to all principles linking together all citizens. The gentleman from Oman said if the state is getting weaker, the tribe is getting stronger. This is true, yes. But the current reality says that this is being manipulated. Sometimes there is support of the tribe, sometimes support of the electoral committee. So there is no continuity in this regard. Mohamed, the quantitative studies, I do agree with you. There were a lot of interviews and a lot of broad analysis, but because we don't have enough time, we just were limited to providing specific examples. So I do agree with you completely. We implemented some criteria, but as I said, we don't have enough time to show all the results. Amin Al-Hajri spoke about the economic changes. Of course, the economy is a field of benefit, and maybe you mean something else. You mean that the economic project is based on only on benefit. Actually, any project, any economic or business project is bringing about changes with itself. But if we talk about a project at the level of the nation, at the level of the region, of course, it's closely connected and related with a lot of social changes. We've been studying and following studies over the last 30 years, we noticed that the family has become smaller, but the nature of the relations is still the same. So there is no cultural, social project. We want to see the extended family and so on. So these issues need more workshops, and we need to deep dive into all these aspects. Mr. Rashid spoke about the role of the state in defining the identity. Yes, GCC governments try to strengthen this identity, but at the same time there is a double standard on the ground. We see strengthening the tribal identity. I'm not against this. We all belong to tribes, but to put this over or above the nation and so on, I'm not for this, especially when it comes to different opportunities, because the citizens are being influenced, because they will vote now for those candidates coming from their own tribe. They will vote for their cousin and so on. We all know that every region has a specific tribe, and unfortunately this is being manipulated in any elections, and anyone, of course, will vote for his or her own tribe, and this is a problem because there is a discontinuity and instability in this regard, and this might also influence development projects. And we will not see a real social change. So society might be opposed to our views, we as researchers and scientists. Another question, Dr. Sahela. The percentage of the presence of tribes in institutions. Of course, the majority of institutions have a lot of tribes. When you talk about financial institutions and industrial institutions, well, there we don't have a lot of tribal representation. I think this is something complicated because it's related to competence and skills and being offered a job or being accepted in an industrial organization or financial organization. They have the specific criteria to accept people. So Khalid Muftah, you spoke about the social isolation due to the exclusion of GCC labor. Well, GCC labor is very important to reach the integration we're all aspiring for, and I think due to the blockade, a lot of families are now split and divided, but the main issue, we should not be concerned because of the presence of foreigners among us, and Western societies already overcame this issue, and all communities living among us are still holding to their own identity. We're a unique society. The labor here is temporary. Maximum they stay 5 or 10 years when we talk about Arab labor, and maybe there is a concern related to with regard to integration. There is no integration of Arab communities, Qataris and Lebanese, Qataris and Palestinians and so on. There may be superficial relations, so there is no real social integration. If these communities are gonna be here to stay, yes, this is important, but if they have only temporary contracts, this is a different issue. The absence of parties opened maybe the space for the tribe, yes, and the situation is different maybe in Kuwait. The GCC crisis maybe put an end to the influence of the tribe. There is a real test of the tribes, but this was a limited test for some tribes and tribes. Yes, I'm going to conclude after this and leave the floor for other participants to answer. So, There is a light test, if you want to say, a test of loyalty and belonging to the tribe. But we found out that the tribes put the national values over the tribal values. Dr. Nasser, we spoke about the double standards, but I have a remark related to what Dr. Courtney said. She said that Qatar and the urbanization trend, she said that all this came later on, and this is not true. The majority of the inhabitants of Qatar have ever lived in cities. Of course, in winter, they move to other areas, but they are not classified as Bedouins. And if you have population or inhabitants who are spending most of the year on the coast, so we don't consider them as Bedouin. Sorry, I'm not gonna answer all questions. Maybe I'll take a bunch of questions and give one answer. If I want to talk about education. The paper is available at the Arab Center for Studies, and what I presented was only a summary. When we talk about the knowledge level of GCC students aged between or age at 10, is the same knowledge level of the student in the West who is aged 5. Education is important, but the content is more important. The content of education needs leadership. One of our ministers in Kuwait got his PhD, but it was at the end of the day falsified one, a wrong. It was a fraud, and he was a minister. So we go back to the political will. We don't have the political will. No one has a clear idea about what we want to do for this society. So I repeat that we don't have a clear political will in the GCC society. We're producing about 50%, 55% of the gross or the BIP of the whole Arab world. So this is a huge percentage. Maybe we can mention the Jordanian example. Two cannot go into ministries in Jordan, the Hashemite and the those who have no expertise. So you cannot nominate anyone to be minister. Education is very important. Culture, Dr. Kaltham spoke about culture, and she mentioned also arranged marriages. If there was a scientific culture among our society, people would understand that marriage among relatives is bringing about a lot of health problems. So for those who are not yet married, please don't marry from the circle of your relatives. I said also another issue, the state does not have a clear plan for integration in a country such as Kuwait. We have regions for Sunnis, for Shias, a region for specific tribes, regions for specific families, and I think this is due to deficit. Before we were distributing houses randomly, and afterwards every family was trying to buy a house in an area which has also the same family with the same family name. And that was actually a big mistake. Another issue, one of the colleagues spoke about someone spoke about an educational vision, but there is no political vision. belonging to a tribe, well, I said earlier, there is a cake and everyone wants to keep this cake for himself, but on the longer term, I can tell you something about the population structure in Kuwait. In 2015, 25% of non-Kuwaitis are domestic workers, and a little bit more than 74% are employed in the private sector, and 4% are working in the public sector. If we take a decision to shut down the private sector, of course, we cannot expect Kuwaiti citizens to work in the private sector, and if they want to work there, of course, they're going to ask for high salaries. This is something which can put to discussion. There was a study actually conducted in Kuwait. If the Sikh minority stopped working or conducted any kind of strike, the financial sector in Kuwait will break down. So I think this is something that we need to change. There is no political vision, and no one wants to bring the bill. Actually, we don't have real parties in Kuwait. You can't have anywhere in the world elections without having real parties. We have a lot of sectarianism, a lot of loyalty to the tribes. Now, after 50 years, we don't have any clear vision. We are talking about the situation, but no one is listening, and no one is willing to change. Why they are not listening? Because they have the checkbook in their pocket. So actually, this is our real problem and our real challenge. I think that the crisis, I said this earlier also, if our oil income is decreasing, we will see really our problems. And I think, and I'm sure that this oil income is going to drop in the coming 4 or 10 years. So we need a better education system. We need other options. I think this is the real problem we're facing now. The way others look at us is a problem. We had a conference in Kuwait, how Westerners look to Kuwaitis or GCC citizens, and the opposite. So how the way they look at us is very negative, and I think this is a big problem. For example, the crisis of the blockade. It's really heartbreaking when you see the blockade. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kaltham, for the clarification. As far as this gentleman's question about whether people give up political rights for material kind of comfort, this is basically comes from a rentier state theory. This is the theory that's dominated Western political science when it comes to the Gulf. And I think it's incorrect to think that people would give up their kind of political rights just to have free education and healthcare. And but that is what has dominated the field, and that's kind of what we're kind of trying to fight against by showing that it's actually much more complex. And that goes to the question about why I didn't include Oman. I basically was looking at what I thought were the 3 wealthiest, and so the 3 wealthiest countries of the GCC, so essentially those which would, in theory, be most able to buy off citizens, yet it doesn't work that way. And I agree about tribalism is not the same as the tribe. I think one thing that gets difficult is to tease apart what's social and what's political. So for instance, voting for your cousin, is that a social act or is that a political act? So it raises that question, and I'll stop there.
I'd like to thank all our brilliant speakers. This is why it took us more time, so sorry that we were not able to take all questions. Wish you a very nice day, and also